You have been told a story of peace. You have been raised on the image of a silent, starlit night where the world held its breath in reverence. You believe in the pristine stillness of a stable, the gentle lowing of cattle, and a singular bright star guiding wise men to a moment of divine tranquility. This is the version painted on glass ornaments and sung in hymnals. But the data, the historical records, the astronomical charts, and the forbidden oral traditions of the Near East suggests a reality that is far more terrifying. The night in question was not silent. It was a time of cosmic upheaval, political terror, and ancient blood rituals performed under the gaze of a dying sun. The world did not pause in reverence, it paused in fear. Here is what the gilded legends have hidden from you. Let me show you the shadows that danced on the walls of history 2 millennia ago. You're watching The Myth Weaver, unraveling the forbidden threads. If you dare to look beyond the veil of history, subscribing ensures you won't miss the next revelation. To understand the truth of that night, we must first dismantle the calendar itself. The date of December 25th is a construct, a mask placed over a much older, darker visage. In the ancient world, winter was not a season of festivities, it was a season of survival. The people of antiquity watched the sun grow weaker with each passing day, the shadows lengthening like grasping fingers across the earth. There was a primal, gnawing fear that one year the sun would simply refuse to return. The solstice was the hinge of the year, the terrifying nadir where the solar deity died and had to be resurrected through sheer will and sacrifice. By placing the nativity on this date, history absorbed the gravity of the Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, and the chaotic fervor of Saturnalia. But strip away the Roman rebranding, and you are left with the raw atmosphere of Judea in the 1st century BC. This was not a land of pastoral quiet. It was a province under the iron heel of an empire, a place where the air tasted of copper and dust. The eagle Roman cast a shadow over every village, and the roads were not lined with pilgrims, but with the crosses of those who dared to defy the legions. The peace of Augustus was maintained at the edge of a gladius. In this suffocating atmosphere, the arrival of the Magi takes on a completely different tone. Folklore has softened them into 3 benevolent kings atop camels, bearing gifts. But the original texts and the historical context of the East paint them as Magoi, Zoroastrian priest-astrologers from the Parthian Empire. You must understand the geopolitical tension here. Parthia was Rome's only true rival, a superpower to the east that had crushed Roman armies. For high-ranking Parthian sorcerers to cross the border into a Roman client kingdom was not a quaint visit. It was a diplomatic incursion. It was an act of espionage cloaked in mysticism.
They were not following a simple star. Ancient astronomy was not about pretty lights in the sky. It was the mechanism of prophecy. The Magoi were tracking a planetary alignment, likely a triple conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in the constellation of Pisces. In the language of forbidden myths, this wasn't just a sign of a birth. Jupiter represented the king, Saturn represented the protector of the Jews, and Pisces was the house of the last days. To the eyes of a sorcerer, the sky was screaming that the old order was ending. They didn't come to a stable to smile at a baby. They came to witness the death of an age and the birth of a new cosmic cycle. They walked into Jerusalem, the heart of Herod's paranoia, and asked, "Where is he who is born King of the Jews?" This question was a spark in a room full of vapor. It brings us to the true monster of this story, Herod the Great. History remembers him as a builder, the man who expanded the Second Temple to glorious heights. But the folklore of the streets of Jerusalem remembered him as a madman rotting from the inside out. By this time, Herod was an old man, consumed by an agonizing disease that modern medicine struggles to diagnose. Gangrene of the genitals, worms breeding in his flesh, a stench so foul his attendants could barely stand to be him. He was a dying beast, lashing out at the shadows. He had already murdered his own wife, Mariamne, whom he loved obsessively, preserving her body in honey to pretend she was still alive. He had strangled his own sons because he feared they plotted against him. When the Magoi arrived asking for the new king, it wasn't a spiritual inquiry to Herod, it was a confirmation of his deepest nightmares. The massacre that followed, the slaughter of the innocents, is often debated by secular historians due to a lack of Roman census records confirming it. But in the landscape of dark legends, the silence of the record is the loudest sound. In a reign defined by purges and secret executions, the disappearance of a few dozen male infants in the tiny hill town of Bethlehem would barely make a footnote in the imperial archives. It was just another Tuesday under the reign of the rotting king. The horror of that winter was not limited to the palace. The entire population was in motion, displaced by the census of Quirinius. This was not a bureaucratic formality, it was an act of subjugation. To be counted was to be taxed. To be taxed was to admit you were property of Rome. Families were forced onto the treacherous roads in the dead of winter, vulnerable to bandits, wolves, and the freezing rain that lashes the Judean hills in December. The image of a young woman riding a donkey is romanticized, but the reality was a grueling, desperate trek through a hostile landscape, heavily pregnant, knowing that the soldiers at the checkpoints viewed you as nothing more than a number in a ledger.
And amidst this human misery, the spiritual veil was thinning. The folklore of the region speaks of the shepherds, not the clean, pious figures of the nativity sets, but outcasts. In first-century Judea, shepherds were often considered unclean, unable to keep the strict purity laws because of their contact with animals and blood. Word stratia means army. They saw a celestial army. In the context of the apocalyptic expectations of the time, this wasn't a lullaby, it was a declaration of war. The sky tearing open to reveal a battalion of non-human entities would be a sight of absolute primal terror. We must also consider the silence of the inn. The word used in the original Greek, kataluma, rarely means a commercial hotel. It usually refers to a guest room or an upper chamber. The fact that there was no room means the house was full of relatives, packed tight against the cold. The manger was likely in the lower floor of a peasant home, where animals were brought in at night to provide heat for the family above. The birth happened in the dirt, in the smell of manure and damp wool, surrounded by the breathing of livestock, hidden away from the prying eyes of census takers and soldiers. It was a clandestine event. This is the setting of the true story. A world balanced on the knife edge of prophecy and politics, a dying tyrant on the throne, foreign sorcerers crossing the borders, the sky signaling the end of the world, and a population crushed under the weight of empire. As we peel back these layers, we find that the story isn't about a silent night at all. It is about a desperate, dangerous hope ignited in the deepest dark. But to understand why this specific event shattered time itself, we have to look at what was happening in the invisible world, the war of the spirits that the ancients believed was raging directly above their heads. The folklore of the lost years suggests that this alignment didn't just signal a birth, it signaled a return. The ancient texts of the Sethians and the Forbidden Gospels speak of the archons, the rulers of the planetary spheres, being disturbed. They sensed a vibration in the ether that terrified them. The star was a breach in their defenses. While Rome worried about borders and taxes, the true powers of the ancient world, the gods of old, the spirits of the air, were watching Bethlehem with a predatory gaze. They knew what the humans did not, that the barrier between the divine and the profane had just been shattered. If you are beginning to see the cracks in the porcelain image of Christmas, you are ready to go deeper. We have only just stepped onto the road. The journey from the manger leads into the wilderness of the forbidden, where the history we know dissolves into the myths we fear. The next thread we must pull involves the mysterious gap in the timeline, the years where the record goes silent and the legends of the East begin to speak. The silence is deafening. For nearly 2 decades, the canonical texts offer nothing, a sheer vertical cliff in the biography of the most influential figure in human history. We are told he was a carpenter, a simple tradesman in a dusty backwater of the Roman Empire, waiting for his 30th year to begin his mission. But the silence of the scribes is not the silence of history. It is merely the sound of a door being closed to the public. When we step away from the sanctioned Gospels and put our ear to the ground of the ancient world,
we hear the faint, rhythmic thrum of a traveler walking the Silk Road. The legends of the East do not speak of a carpenter. They speak of a student, a master, and a traveler known as Saint Isa. Tibetan manuscripts, hidden for centuries in the remote monasteries of the Himalayas, describe a young man from Israel who arrived in India to study the Vedas and the ways of the Buddha. These are not merely fringe theories. They are persistent, localized memories etched into the folklore of Kashmir and Jagannath. The narrative suggests that the event of Christmas was not an isolated miracle, but a catalyst for a grand tour of the ancient mystery schools. The boy born under the convergence of planets did not stay idle. He sought the source of the wisdom that the Magi had brought to his cradle. Consider the Magi again. We must strip away the Christmas card imagery of three kings on camels. In the context of lost civilizations, the Magi were the custodians of the Zoroastrian fire, the inheritors of the Babylonian stargazers, and perhaps the keepers of knowledge that predated the flood. When they knelt in Bethlehem, they were not just paying homage, they were acknowledging a transfer of power. They brought gold, frankincense, and myrrh, substances that in the alchemical traditions of the ancient Near East were not mere currency or perfume. They were tools. Gold for the transmutation of the self, frankincense for the bridging of dimensions, and myrrh, the resin of death, for the descent into the underworld. They were equipping an initiate for a journey that would require mastery over life, death, and the spirit realm.
The silence of those 18 years is the silence of the incubation chamber. If we look at the apocryphal texts, the books deemed too dangerous, too volatile, or too weird for the official Bible, we see a very different picture of this Christmas child growing up. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas, a text loathed by early church fathers, depicts a child not of serene grace, but of terrifying raw power. It describes a boy who withers a playmate for bumping into him, who strikes his teachers blind for correcting him, and who breathes life into clay birds merely to watch them fly. This is not the gentle shepherd. This is a conduit of cosmic energy learning to control the voltage coursing through a human frame. These stories, suppressed and burned, align more closely with the dark folklore of the trickster gods and the elemental spirits than the sanitized Sunday school lessons we know. They suggest that the incarnation celebrated on December 25th was a violent intrusion of the divine into the physical, a merging that was initially chaotic and dangerous. This brings us to the desert. While the boy may have traveled east, the spiritual landscape of Judea was being shaped by a group that history has often sidelined, the Essenes. To understand the true atmosphere of the time, you must understand Qumran. The Dead Sea Scrolls reveal a sect of apocalyptic ascetics who had severed ties with the corrupt temple in Jerusalem. They were waiting for the teacher of righteousness and the war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. They lived in the caves, obsessed with purity, prophecy, and the movements of the celestial bodies. The Essenes were the spiritual preppers of the ancient world. They knew the timeline. They had calculated the weeks of years from the prophecies of Daniel. They knew the window for the arrival was opening. It is highly probable that the figure of John the Baptist, the wild man and camel's hair eating locusts, was an Essene or at least trained by them. The Christmas story is inextricably linked to this desert cult. The manger was likely not a wooden barn behind an inn, but a cave, symbolically returning to the womb of the earth, a practice sacred to the mystery cults of Mithras and the Essene initiations. The birth in the cave was a signal to the watchers in the desert that the countdown had begun.
But why was the timeline so critical? Why did the ancients believe that specific moment, 2,000 years ago, was the turning point? We must look at the concept of the Great Ages. The ancients tracked the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the earth that shifts the backdrop of the stars over thousands of years. The era of the ram, Aries, was ending. The era of the fish, Pisces, was beginning. The Christmas event was the cosmic changing of the guard. The old gods, the gods of blood sacrifice and tribal warfare, were being put on notice. A new archetype was entering the collective consciousness. This transition is never peaceful. It is a shearing of the metaphysical fabric. The slaughter of the innocents by Herod, often dismissed by secular historians as folklore due to a lack of Roman records, fits perfectly into the pattern of a dark magical working. In the logic of the forbidden myths, when a great light enters the world, the shadow lashes out.
Herod was not just a paranoid king, he was a pawn in a spiritual blockade. The massacre was a ritual attempt to snuff out the frequency before it could stabilize. It echoes the story of Moses and the Pharaoh, and the even older myths of the child god Zeus, hidden from the devouring Cronus. The narrative is always the same. The old order seeks to consume the new before it can draw breath. If you find yourself drawn to these shadowed corners of history, where the official record blurs into myth, you are walking the path of the seeker. To ensure you don't lose the trail as we descend further into these forgotten archives, subscribing allows you to keep pace with the investigation. We must also consider the entities that we're watching. The Gnostic texts, buried in the Egyptian desert at Nag Hammadi, speak of the archons, parasitic entities that feed on human fear and ignorance. They view the material world as a prison they control. To them, the event in Bethlehem was a prison break. The Gnostics believed that the true Savior was not sent by the creator of this world, whom they viewed as a flawed, jealous demiurge, but by the alien God, the unknowable source of pure light beyond the stars. In this framework, Christmas is not a celebration of the status quo, it is a declaration of war against the matrix of reality itself. The star was the signal flare of an invasion force. This recontextualization changes everything. It turns the nativity scene from a pastoral tableau into a command center. The shepherds were the witnesses, the magi were the intelligence officers, and the child was the weapon. As the timeline moves from the birth to the ministry, we see the friction increase. The miracles were not magic tricks, they were glitches in the simulation, moments where the higher laws of the kingdom overwrote the lower laws of physics. Walking on water, transmuting matter, healing the sick, these were demonstrations that the archon's control over the physical realm was slipping.
But the most forbidden aspect of this lore lies in the bloodline itself. The legends of the Holy Grail, which would surface 1,000 years later, hint at a secret that the Church fought desperately to suppress. The idea that the divine did not just visit, but lingered, that the bloodline continued. This brings us to the edge of the abyss, where history meets the most controversial of all theories. The Grail was never a cup, it was a vessel of a different kind. The ancient French legends of the Sangreal, the royal blood, suggest that the story did not end on the cross, nor did it end with the Ascension. They suggest that the family, the retinue, fleeing the persecution in Judea, carried the seed of this new age to the shores of Europe, specifically to the Druidic lands of Gaul. Here, the Christmas story collides with the Druidic mysteries. The Druids, the priests of the oak, had long prophesied the coming of a figure who would heal the earth. When the refugees arrived, bearing the blood and the teachings of the one born under the star, the Druids did not reject them. They recognized the fulfillment of their own dark prophecies. The blending of Judean mysticism and Celtic nature magic created a potent underground stream of spirituality that would eventually manifest as the Arthurian legends. The once and future king is an echo of the King of Kings, a mythic resonance that vibrates through the bedrock of the West. As we peel back these layers, the comfortable warmth of the holiday fire begins to chill. We realize that we are celebrating a mystery we have forgotten how to understand. We are reenacting rituals, the tree, the lights, the gifts, that are debris from a collision between civilizations. The tree is Yggdrasil, the world ash. The lights are the fires against the winter dark. The gifts are the alchemical offerings to the initiate. We are walking through a museum of spiritual warfare, blindfolded by commercialism. But the darkest chapter is yet to be read. The narrative of the birth is inextricably tied to the narrative of the end, the Alpha and the Omega, the return. If the first arrival caused such a disturbance in the ether that stars moved and kings killed, what will the second arrival look like? The ancient forbidden texts do not speak of a baby in a manger for the next cycle. They speak of a warrior. They speak of the sky rolling back like a scroll. The Christmas story is only the first act of a two-part drama, and to understand a finale, we must look at the enemies that were awakened 2,000 years ago and have been waiting in the shadows ever since. The forces that Herod served did not die with him. They reorganized, they infiltrated, and they have been writing their own version of history, a counterfeit script designed to hide the true nature of the event that split time in two.
This counterfeit script was not written with ink, but with the blood of martyrs and the ashes of burned libraries. To understand the reorganization of these dark forces, we must look at the landscape of the ancient world immediately following the event. The empire did not simply ignore the anomaly, it sought to absorb it. The strategy shifted from eradication to amalgamation. If you cannot kill the messianic signal, you jam the frequency with noise. And the loudest noise in the ancient world, the static that had been broadcasting for centuries before the birth, was the frequency of Saturn. You have likely heard the pedestrian explanation that Christmas is merely a co-opted pagan festival, a rebranding of Saturnalia to make the new faith palatable to the masses. This is the safe academic version of history. It is sterilized. It misses the terrifying metaphysical reality of what was actually happening during the winter solstice. The choice of this season was not a marketing decision. It was an act of spiritual territorial warfare. The solstice, the darkest night of the year, was the domain of entities that demanded the most from humanity. It was the time when the barrier between the living and the dead was thinnest, when the sun, the cosmic eye, blinked, and the old gods walked freely. Saturn, or Kronos, was the titan who devoured his own children to prevent them from usurping his throne. Look at the parallel. Herod, the earthly agent of the spirit, slaughters the innocents in Bethlehem to prevent a usurper. The archetype repeats. The shadow of Saturn lay heavy over the region. By planting the celebration of the birth on the very festival of the Child Eater, it was a declaration of war. It was a sealing of the breach. But the entities displaced by this act did not vanish into the ether. They retreated into the folklore, hiding in the traditions we now consider harmless. The Krampus, the Perchta, the darker companions of St. Nicholas, these are not inventions of medieval peasants. They are the residual memories of the entities that once demanded blood during the solstice, now demoted to bogeymen, waiting in the periphery of the candlelight. As we peel back these layers of festive paint to reveal the ancient rot beneath, it becomes clear that we are dealing with a history that has been deliberately obscured. If you find yourself drawn to these investigations into the forbidden corners of our past, and you wish to see the rest of this tapestry unraveled, your support helps keep the lantern lit in these dark archives.
We must also reconsider the visitors. The nativity scene on your mantle displays 3 kings, serene and noble, bearing gifts. But the text calls them magi. This is the root of our word magician. These were not monarchs in the Western sense. They were high-ranking sorcerers, priests of the Zoroastrian order from the East, likely Babylon or Persia. They were the keepers of the pre-flood wisdom, the inheritors of the knowledge of the Watchers. Why would the masters of the occult travel months across a bandit-ridden desert to bow before a peasant child? Because they knew the era of their power was ending. They were tracking a celestial anomaly that defied the mechanics of the known universe. The star, described in the texts, behaved with intention. It stopped, it moved, it guided. In the ancient worldview, stars were not balls of burning gas. They were living intelligences, angelic or demonic powers. The Magi were following a high-ranking spiritual entity that was signaling a regime change. Their arrival was not just a gesture of respect, it was a formal surrender of the old magical order to the new authority. They brought gold, frankincense, and myrrh, materials used in temple worship and burial, acknowledging that the mechanism of connection to the divine had shifted from the complex rituals of the ziggurats to the person of this child. But there is a darker implication here, one found in the apocryphal writings that did not make it into the canon. Some traditions suggest the Magi were also guarding against the counterbirth. Just as the light was manifesting, the darkness was coalescing. The concept of the Antichrist is not merely a future threat, it is a recurring principle. For every action in the spiritual ether, there is an equal and opposite reaction. As the child was born, the ancient prisons of the deep trembled. This brings us to one of the most chilling historical footnotes of that era, recorded by the Greek historian Plutarch. He writes of a strange event that occurred during the reign of Tiberius, shortly after these events in Bethlehem. A ship pilot named Themis was sailing near the island of Poxi when a booming voice from the shore called his name. The voice commanded him to carry a message to the mainland. The great Pan is dead. When he delivered the news, a collective groan, a sound of mixture of amazement and terror, rose from the land. Pan was the representative of the wild, chaotic, elemental spirits of the old world. He was the only Greek god said to die. Why then? Why at that specific moment in history? The birth in Bethlehem had sent a shockwave through the spiritual hierarchy. The gods of the nations, the territorial spirits that had governed humanity since the fall of the Tower of Babel, were being served an eviction notice. The silence of the oracles began at this time. The Pythamus at Delphi, who had guided empires for centuries with her trance-induced prophecies, began to sputter and fail. The spirits were departing. The line was being cut. However, a dying beast is the most dangerous. As the influence of the old pantheon waned, they did not leave our plane of existence entirely. They went underground. They embedded themselves in the esoteric societies, in the Gnostic sects that rose like weeds in the 1st century. They whispered a new lie, that the physical world is a mistake, a prison created by a lesser, evil god, and that the serpent in the garden was the liberator. This inversion of truth is the foundation of the counterfeit script we spoke of. They reframed the narrative of the birth not as a rescue mission, but as an invasion by a foreign deity. This is the secret doctrine held by the mystery schools that have operated in the shadows for 2,000 years. They view the event of Christmas not as a joy, but as a catastrophe that severed humanity from the wisdom of the serpent, and they have been working to repair that severance ever since. To understand the full scoop of this, we have to look at the geography of the birth. Bethlehem is not just a random village. It sits on the edge of the Judean wilderness, a place historically associated with the banishment of the scapegoat. It is near the location of the Herodium, the massive fortress palace of Herod, which loomed over the town like a man-made mountain. The visual contrast was deliberate. The fortress represented the pinnacle of human power, backed by the dark rituals of Rome and the blood of the innocents. The manger represented the absolute zero of human power. The war was fought not with swords, but with presence. The landscape itself holds memories. If you dig into the local folklore of the region, specifically the Bedouin legends that predate the Crusades, there are stories of night walkers that plagued the hills around Bethlehem, spirits that would steal the breath of children. The shepherds were not just watching for wolves, they were watching for things that had no shape. The glory of the Lord that shone around them was not a soft, ambient glow. It was a terrifying, combat-grade radiance that shattered the darkness of the heavy, spirit-infested night. The fear of the shepherds was the primal fear of men who suddenly realize they are standing on the front lines of a galactic conflict without armor.
We sanitized this, we put it on greeting cards, but the reality was visceral. The smell of ozone and fear, the sudden realization that the sky was not empty and the silence was not peace. It was the holding of breath before the plunge. And as we move forward to examine what happened to the bloodline that Herod tried to extinguish, we will find that the escape to Egypt was not merely a flight from soldiers, it was a descent into the heart of the ancient magical world, a journey into the land of the dead to confront the oldest gods on their own soil. The child did not just survive, he went into the belly of the beast. Egypt was the cradle of the oldest magic the world had ever known. When the family crossed the border, they were not merely entering a foreign political jurisdiction, they were stepping into the shadow of the pyramids, massive geometric batteries designed to funnel souls into the afterlife. This was the land of Thoth, the architect of reality, and of Cyrus, the lord of the dead. For thousands of years, the priesthoods here had perfected the arts of necromancy and star binding. To bring the child here was a strategic maneuver of immense irony. The narrative we are often sold is one of hiding, a quiet, dusty anonymity among the reeds of the Nile. But the apocryphal texts, those forbidden books left out of the canon, paint a drastically different picture. They suggest that the arrival of this child in Egypt triggered a spiritual earthquake that cracked the foundations of the local pantheon. The Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew, a text often dismissed by modern scholars but revered by the ancients for its preservation oral tradition, describes the desert crossing not as a silent trek, but as a procession of dominance over the natural order. It speaks of dragons, great serpentine beasts of the wasteland, emerging from their caves. In the folklore of the time, these were not biological animals, but elemental spirits, the guardians of the desolate places. The legend states that upon seeing the child, these terrors did not attack, they bowed. The terror of the wilderness recognized a frequency of authority that predated the stones they slept on. This was the first indication that the laws of physics and biology were being rewritten around this specific bloodline. The desert, a place of death and trial for the Israelites centuries prior, was now submitting. But the true confrontation occurred when they reached the cities. We must visualize the atmosphere of first-century Egypt. It was a sensory overload of incense, burning flesh from sacrifices, and the towering animal-headed statues of gods who demanded absolute servitude. These statues were not viewed as stone carvings, they were considered vessels. The ancient ritual of opening the mouth was believed to literally draw a deity or spirit into the stone, allowing it to see, hear, and influence the material world. The land was thick with these inhabited idols.
When the family entered the city of Sotian, according to the ancient accounts, they sought shelter in a temple, the very heart of the adversary's territory. The moment the child crossed the threshold, the silence of the sanctuary was shattered. The 365 idols, representing every day of the year and every aspect of daily dominion, reportedly collapsed. They didn't just fall, they were pulverized, their faces grinding into the dust. This was the falling of the idols predicted by Isaiah, but in the context of the dark legends, it was an exorcism on a city-wide scale. The spirits inhabiting the stone could not exist in the proximity of the new arrival. It was a displacement of spiritual mass. If you are fascinated by these lost narratives and want to support the excavation of myths that history tried to bury, your subscription helps us keep the lanterns lit in these dark archives. This collapse sent shockwaves through the Egyptian priesthood. The governors of the region, men who worshipped power, came to see the devastation. They expected a conqueror with an army. Instead, they found an infant. This paradox is the core of the mythos. The weapon that destroys the old world is not a sword, but a presence. The exile in Egypt, therefore, was not a pause in the story, it was a campaign. The child was being dipped into the stream of ancient history, effectively harrowing the land that had once enslaved his ancestors, breaking the spiritual chains before he could even speak. While this silent war was being waged in the shadows of the Nile, a very loud, visceral horror was unfolding back in Judea. We cannot understand the Christmas narrative without looking directly at the blood that stains it. The flight to Egypt was necessitated by the massacre of the innocents, an event so gruesome that many Victorian historians tried to claim it never happened, simply because they could not reconcile such brutality with the civilized Roman era. But archaeology and the psychological profile of Herod the Great suggest it was all too real. Herod was a man disintegrating. Historical records tell us he was suffering from a horrific, gangrenous illness that rotted his body while he was still alive. The smell of his own decay surrounded him. He was paranoid, seeing knives in every shadow, convinced that his own sons were plotting against him, which they were. He had already executed his favorite wife and several of his children. To a mind that broken, that steeped in blood and pain, the news brought by the Magi was not a prophecy, it was a death sentence. A king of the Jews had been born. This was not a spiritual title to Herod, it was a political usurper.
The order he gave was clinical in its cruelty. It was a scorched earth policy applied to genealogy. He did not know who the child was, so he decided to erase the entire generation. The soldiers sent to Bethlehem were not fighting an army, they were executing a purge. They went house to house, tearing children from their mothers. This is the Ramah prophecy. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted, because they are no more. In the context of dark folklore, this massacre takes on a ritualistic dimension. Herod was, in effect, offering a mass sacrifice to the dark gods of power and preservation. It was a bloodletting designed to secure his throne, a magical thinking that believed if enough innocent blood was spilled, the threads of fate could be cut. The screams that echoed through the hill country of Judea that night were the sound of the old world dying violently. It was the empire striking back against the invasion. The darkness was not going to let the light enter without extracting a heavy toll.
This tragedy creates a haunting juxtaposition that the holiday cards ignore. While the child was safe in Egypt, surrounded by the crumbling statues of false gods, the soil of Bethlehem was turning red. The peace on earth proclaimed by the angels was immediately followed by the slaughter of the innocent. This is the duality of the forbidden myth. The arrival of the divine does not bring immediate peace, it brings a sword. It incites the darkness to reveal itself. The shadows deepen because the light has become blinding. The escape to Egypt and the subsequent massacre serve as the grim opening act to the hidden years. For the next decade or more, the narrative goes dark. The canonical Gospels are silent, but the legends are not. They speak of a boy growing up with power he barely understands, of miracles in the mud, of clay birds taking flight, and of a wisdom that terrified his teachers. The myth-weaver thread suggests that during this time, the child was not just learning carpentry, he was learning the architecture of the human soul, preparing for a confrontation that would make the falling idols of Egypt look like a parlor trick. As the years passed, Herod finally succumbed to his rotting disease, his body failing to contain his malice. The angel reappeared in a dream, the primary method of communication in this saga, and gave the command to return. Those who sought the child's life are dead. It is a stark, cold sentence. The monsters were gone, but the landscape they returned to had changed. The pieces were moving. The stage was being reset for the adult conflict.
The return from Egypt was the closing of the circle. Out of Egypt I called my son. This was a deliberate echoing of the Exodus. Just as Israel was called out of slavery to become a nation, the child was called out of the land of magic to become the Messiah. But he was returning to a land occupied by Rome, policed by a new Herod, and spiritually suffocated by a religious elite that had forgotten the very prophecies they claimed to protect. He was walking back into the lion's den, but this time he was no longer a helpless infant. He was a force that had seen the gods of Egypt bow. The silence of the lost years was about to end, and the noise that would follow would shatter the Roman peace forever. The preparation was over. The infiltration was complete. Now, the revelation was about to begin. But the revelation did not come with a trumpet blast. It came with a shroud. The family vanished into the limestone hills of Galilee, retreating into a hamlet so insignificant it wasn't even mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, the Talmud, or the works of Josephus. Nazareth. In the eyes of the Judean elite, this was a spiritual wasteland, a place of rough accents and unwashed hands. Can anything good come from Nazareth? Was not merely an insult, it was a geographical dismissal. But for a child carrying a target on his back, obscurity was the ultimate armor. The narrative descends into the silent years, 18 years of historical void where the canonical texts go black. Yet in the folklore of the region and the forbidden margins of history, these years were not empty. They were a crucible. He did not simply idle in a workshop sweeping sawdust. The Greek word used to describe him, tekton, has been softened by centuries of translation into carpenter, evoking images of wooden toys and gentle craftsmanship. But in the first century context, in a region dominated by stone, a tekton was a builder, a mason, a heavy laborer. He would have worked with the bones of the earth, limestone and basalt, callousing his hands on the very material he would later claim to have created. And just 4 miles north of this sleepy village lay the great scar on the landscape, the city of Sepphoris.
Sepphoris is the ghost in the Christmas story, the lost city that shaped the man. During his youth, this Roman provincial capital was a massive construction site, rebuilt by Herod Antipas to be the ornament of all Galilee. It is almost certain that a tekton from Nazareth would have walked the hour-long path to find work there. This changes the texture of the myth entirely. He wasn't isolated in a pastoral bubble. He was daily walking into a cosmopolitan hub of Roman luxury, Greek theater, and Jewish collaboration. He saw the mosaics of Dionysus, the towering pagan temples, and the crushing taxation that funded them. He saw the enemy up close, not as a distant abstract evil, but as the foreman shouting orders, the soldier demanding tribute, and the priest compromising with the occupier. he was building the very world he came to dismantle. This duality, the humble village mystic and the observer of imperial power, fuels the darker legends of his adolescence. The apocryphal texts, those books burned or banned by early church councils, suggest a power struggling to be contained. The infancy Gospel of Thomas paints a terrifying picture of a boy who withers a neighbor's hand for criticizing him or strikes a teacher dead for striking him. While theological purists dismiss these stories as crude fiction, mythologically they represent something vital, the volatility of divine power in a human vessel. They suggest that the peace of the silent years was actually a period of intense discipline, a taming of the storm before it could be released. If you find yourself drawn to these shadowed corners of history where the official narrative frays into mystery, subscribing ensures you are present for every new excavation we undertake into the forbidden past. The silence deepens when we look for his teachers. The official story says he had none, that his wisdom was innate. But the landscape whispers of the Essenes. Out in the desolate crags of Qumran near the Dead Sea, a sect of Sons of Light had withdrawn from the corruption of the temple. They wore white linen, practiced ritual immersion, and spoke of a coming battle between light and darkness. Their writings, hidden in clay jars for 2,000 years, echo with phrases that would later fall from the Nazarene's lips. Did he walk the desert paths to sit at their fires? The folklore of the East goes even further, spinning tales of a traveler named Isa who walked the Silk Road to study the Vedas of India or the wisdom of the Druids in the mist-shrouded Isles of the West. While historians scoff, the myth weaver sees the pattern. The hero must journey to the underworld, to the edges of the map, to gather the fragmented truths before returning to the center.
But the only verified breach in the silence occurred when he was 12. The family traveled to Jerusalem for Passover, a journey of pilgrimage that turned into a prelude to disruption. In the chaos of the caravan returning home, he was lost. For 3 days, a premonition of the 3 days in the tomb, he was missing. When they found him, he was not crying in the streets. He was in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening and asking questions. This was not a Sunday school scene. This was the lion's den. The temple was the epicenter of political and religious power, a place where the high priest walked in robes worth more than a village's lifetime earnings. For a boy from the sticks of Galilee to hold court with the doctoral elite of Jerusalem was a subversion of the social order. He was sitting in the seat of authority in his father's house, signaling that the lease of the current tenants was expiring. The text says everyone was amazed at his understanding, but in the context of the looming conflict, this wasn't admiration, it was the first tremor of an earthquake. He was assessing the machinery of the temple, analyzing the corruption from the inside, marking the structural weaknesses of the institution he would later prophesy would be thrown down, stone by stone. Then the shutter closes again. He goes back to Nazareth and is subduant to them. The silence resumes for another 18 years, but the atmosphere has shifted. The legend suggests that these were the years of grief. Joseph, the protector, the man who heard angels in his dreams and navigated the flight to Egypt, disappears from the record. By the time the ministry begins, Mary is a widow. The Son of God had to learn the crushing weight of human mortality, not through theology, but through the empty seat at the table. He had to become the head of the household, bearing the economic burden, paying the Roman taxes that strangled the peasantry, feeling the heat of the imperial boot on his own neck. The folklore of the region speaks of a darkening horizon during these years. The Roman occupation became more brutal. The zealots, daggermen who slit throats in crowds, were whispering of revolution in the caves of Galilee. False messiahs rose up, promising to part the Jordan River or call down fire, only to be crucified by the hundreds, their crosses lining the roads like grim mile markers. The air was thick with apocalyptic expectation. The people were starving for a savior, but they wanted a warrior king, a new David to drive the Romans into the sea.
In the quiet of the workshop, shaping wood and stone, the Nazarene waited. He knew that the sword they wanted was not the sword he brought. He was preparing for a war that was ancient before Rome was even a village of mud huts. The principalities he had faced in Egypt were regrouping. The demons he would soon cast out were watching from the shadows of the synagogues and the palaces. The silence of Nazareth
was the deep breath before the plunge. The boy was gone. The artisan was finishing his work. The piece was about to be moved into the center of the board, and the lost years were ending not with a whisper, but with the sound of approaching footsteps towards the River Jordan, where a wild man in camel's hair was already screaming that the axe was laid to the root of the tree. The dormant myths were about to wake up. The Jordan River cuts through the earth like a scar, a winding fracture in the crust of the Rift Valley, the lowest point on the face of the planet. In the ancient mind, geography was theology, and to descend into the Jordan was to descend into the throat of the underworld, a place of transition between the life of the desert and the promise of the land. It was here, amidst the reeds and the thick, muddy water, that the silence of 30 years was finally shattered. The wild man, John, was not merely a preacher, he was a seismic event. He stood waist-deep in the current, looking less like a man and more like a relic of the Bronze Age unearthed and given breath, screaming about vipers and fire. He was the final barrier, the last sentinel of the Old Covenant, preparing the way for something that would terrify the religious establishment. When the Nazarene stepped out of the crowd, the air itself seemed to compress. There is a terrifying intimacy in the accounts of this moment, a sense that the camouflaged war was suddenly becoming visible. He did not come to confess sins, for the legends say he had none, but to identify with the broken lineage of humanity, to physically enter the contaminated waters of the world. As he rose from the river, the barrier between dimensions dissolved. The text described the heavens not merely opening, but tearing apart, a violent rupture in the fabric of the sky. The Spirit descended, not as a poetic metaphor, but as a tangible, heavy presence, anointing him for a conflict that would bypass the Roman legions entirely and strike directly at the dark powers sitting on the thrones of the air.
But the coronation was immediately followed by exile. The narrative does not allow for a celebration. The same Spirit that descended upon him immediately drove him, literally cast him out into the wilderness. This was the Judean waste, a landscape of limestone and flint, scorching heat and freezing nights, a place the Bedouin tribes believed was haunted by the jinn and the restless spirits of the condemned. In the folklore of the region, the desert was not empty. It was the domain of Azazel, the demon of the waste, the dwelling place of everything that had been banished from the city of God. By entering the wilderness, the Nazarene was walking deliberately into enemy territory. He was invading the haunt of the jackals to draw out the Alpha. For 40 days, the physical world receded. Hunger clawed at his mind, stripping away the biological tether to reality, inducing a state where the veil between the material and the spiritual is dangerously thin. It is in this state of absolute vulnerability that the adversary approached. The encounter was not a debate, it was a transaction offered in the dark. The tempter, the shadow that had whispered in the gardens of the ancient world, did not offer him food merely to satisfy hunger. He offered him autonomy, the power to sustain himself without the Father, to become a magician turning stones to bread, a sorcerer of the material realm. The refusal was quiet, a rejection of the very foundation of human survival instinct. Then came the vision that ties this narrative to the forgotten empires of the past. The adversary took him to a high place, a summit that existed perhaps only in the spirit, and in a moment of time showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. This is the pivotal moment for those who study the forbidden myths. What kingdoms did he see? He saw Rome, certainly, in its marble splendor. He saw the Parthians in the east, but the text suggests he saw the glory of them all, meaning the sum total of human civilization under the influence of the dark stars. He saw the ziggurats of Babylon, the pyramids of the Nile, the lost citadels of the pre-flood kings, the empires built on blood and sorcery. The adversary claimed ownership of them all. All this authority I will give you, and their glory, for this has been delivered to me, and I give it to whomever I wish. It was a staggering legal claim. The Dark Prince was asserting that the lost civilizations, the great engines of human history, were his property, deeded to him by the collective sin of mankind. He offered the Nazarene a shortcut. He could have the crown without the cross. He could rule the world, but he would have to bow to the architect of its misery. If you are fascinated by these intersections of history and the unseen and want to see us unravel more of these ancient threads, a simple like on this video goes a long way in helping us keep the archives open.
The rejection of this offer was the declaration of total war. By refusing to take the kingdoms as a vassal of darkness, the Nazarene was declaring his intention to take them by force, not with armies, but with a sacrifice that would break the legal claim of the adversary entirely. He turned his back on the phantom empires and the easy path to power. The devil departed, leaving him alone in the silence of the rocks. But the text adds a chilling addendum. He departed until an opportune time. The shadow would return, not in the loneliness of the desert, but in the betrayal of a friend and the political machinery of the state. He emerged from the wilderness changed. The carpenter was gone. The exorcist had arrived. The accounts of what followed are breathless, a rapid-fire sequence of skirmishes. He moved north to Galilee, the circle of the Gentiles, a region looked down upon by the religious elite of Jerusalem. He began to gather his inner circle, not from the schools of the prophets or the halls of power, but from the docks and the tax booths, fishermen who knew the temper of the sea, and collaborators who knew the corrupt heart of the empire. He was assembling a war party, but they looked like a rabble. The first engagement happened in a synagogue in Capernaum. It was the Sabbath, the day of rest, the day of order. He was teaching, and the authority in his voice was different. It wasn't the quoted citations of the scribes, but the raw command of the author. Suddenly, a man in the congregation screamed. It wasn't the man screaming, but something inside him, a squatter in the human vessel. "Let us alone. What have we to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? Did you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." This is the forbidden myth coming to the surface. The theologians and the priests were still debating who this man was, arguing over lineage and prophecy. But the demons? The demons had no doubt. The entities of the invisible realm recognized him instantly. They knew the vibration of his soul. They remembered him from before the foundations of the earth were laid. The shriek in the synagogue was the sound of the occupation forces realizing the true king had landed on the beach. He silenced the entity and cast it out, a display of power that sent a shockwave through the underground. The word spread not just through the villages, but through the spiritual hierarchy. The lock on the prison door had been broken.
He moved through Galilee like a storm front. He touched the lepers, violating the strictest quarantine laws of Leviticus, and instead of contracting their uncleanness, his purity infected them, consuming the disease. He spoke to the wind and the waves, and they obeyed him as if they recognized the voice that had originally named them. But with every miracle, the shadow grew longer. The religious leaders, the guardians of the status quo, began to whisper that he was using the power of Beelzebub. They could not deny the supernatural power, so they attempted to reframe the source. They were watching a man dismantle the physics of their reality, and it terrified them more than the Roman occupation ever could. The tension was ratcheting up. He was heading back toward Jerusalem, back toward the center of the web. The lost years were over, the preparation in the desert was complete, and the final week was approaching. But before the cross, there was one more barrier to break, one more demonstration that would force the hand of his enemies. He had conquered the wilderness, he had conquered sickness, and he had conquered the demons. Now he had to confront the final enemy. He received word that his friend Lazarus was sick, and intentionally, with a cold calculation that baffled his disciples, he waited. He waited for death to do its work. He waited until the body was in the tomb, until the decay had set in, until the hope was gone. He was drawing the ultimate weapon of the enemy out into the open, preparing to shatter the one fear that held all of humanity in slavery. The stage was set for a confrontation at a graveside that would echo all the way to the Sanhedrin and seal his own death warrant. The darkness was gathering, but the light was about to go nuclear. 4 days. In the ancient Near Eastern understanding of death, this was the threshold of no return. The rabbinical tradition held that the soul hovered over the body for 3 days, seeking to re-enter, hoping for a flicker of life. But by the 4th day, the countenance had changed, the decay had set in, and the spirit had departed for Sheol. To heal a man on the 1st or 2nd day was a miracle. To call a man back on the 4th was an act of war against the underworld itself. When the Nazarene arrived at Bethany, he was not met with hope, but with the suffocating reality of the grave. The stone was rolled across the mouth of the cave, sealing the corruption inside. The sisters warned him of the stench, the visceral, undeniable evidence that the King of Terrors held dominion here. He did not offer platitudes. He stood before the maw of the earth and wept. But this was not the weeping of helpless grief. It was the groaning of a warrior surveying the devastation of his people. He was looking into the face of the enemy he had come to destroy. Then he issued the command that would shatter the silence of the sepulchre. He did not whisper. He shouted into the void, "Lazarus, come out!" It was a summons that violated the laws of nature, a direct challenge to the entropy that governs the universe. And from the darkness, a figure emerged, bound in grave clothes, shuffling out of the abyss. The bind of the fourth day was broken. The shockwave of this moment did not just ripple through the crowd. It struck the heart of the religious establishment in Jerusalem with the force of a hammer. This was the tipping point. Until now, he had been a nuisance, a heretic, perhaps a sorcerer in their eyes. But a man who commands the dead to rise is a man who cannot be controlled by threats of mortality. The Sanhedrin convened in a panic. The high priest, Caiaphas, uttered the prophecy that would define the history of the world, unaware of the irony dripping from his lips. It is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish. They feared the Romans would see this rising movement and crush the nation. They calculated a political assassination to save their fragile peace. They did not realize they were merely moving pieces on a chessboard that had been set before the foundation of the world. They were preparing the sacrifice for the very Passover they sought to protect. If you find yourself drawn to these unearthing of ancient motives and the decoding of forbidden histories, your presence here helps keep the lantern lit as we descend further into the dark. With the warrant for his death quietly circulating among the elite, the final week began. The stage shifted to the eastern gate of Jerusalem. It was the time of the selection of the lambs. Thousands of pilgrims were pouring into the city, driving flocks of unblemished lambs to be inspected by the priests for the sacrifice. And amidst this river of wool and bleeding life, he rode in. But the symbolism here was a deliberate subversion of expectation. A conquering king rides a war horse, signaling dominance and blood. He rode a donkey, the ancient sign of a king coming in peace, fulfilling the cryptic words of the prophet Zechariah.
The crowds, frenzied by the rumors of Lazarus, threw their cloaks on the dusty road. They waved palm branches, the national symbol of Jewish independence, a direct hearkening back to the Maccabean revolt. They were screaming Hosanna, which means save us now. But they were shouting for a political revolution. They wanted a Messiah who would drive a sword through the heart of Caesar. They did not understand that he was riding to his death, not his coronation. He looked over the city, the white stones of the temple gleaming in the sun, and he wept again. He saw the legions of Rome that would surround these walls in 40 years. He saw the fires that would consume the temple. He saw a people who did not recognize the time of their visitation. He entered the temple complex, not to worship, but to shut it down. This was the final provocation. He drove out the money changers and the merchants, overturning the tables in a violent display of authority. This was not a temper tantrum, it was a prophetic enactment. By halting the trade of sacrificial animals, he was symbolically bringing the entire sacrificial system to a halt. He was declaring that the time of bulls and goats was over. The shadow was passing. The substance had arrived. He occupied the temple for days, teaching with a desperate intensity, while the shadows in the corners grew longer, and the whispers of betrayal began to take shape. The atmosphere in the city was electric, thick with the tension of a storm about to break. The air smelled of roasting lamb and impending violence. Judas Iscariot, disillusioned by a Messiah who refused to fight Rome, slipped away into the night to sell the location of his master for the price of a slave, 30 pieces of silver. The clock began to tick down the final hours. They gathered in an upper room, hidden away from the prying eyes of the temple guards. Here, the narrative shifts from the public roar to the intimate whisper. He took the bread and the wine, the ancient elements of the Passover meal that celebrated liberation from Egypt, and he rewrote the script. This is my body. This is my blood. He was binding the ancient covenant to his own veins. He was telling them that the lamb they had eaten for 1,500 years was merely a placeholder for what was about to happen on the hill outside the city.
Then came the darkness of Gethsemane. They left the city, crossing the Kidron Valley, where the blood from the temple sacrifices drained into the brook, turning the water red. They entered the Garden of the Oil Press. The narrative tells us that a great horror came over him. This was not merely the fear of physical torture. Many martyrs have gone to their deaths singing. This was something else. He was beginning to feel the weight of the spiritual cup he had to drink, the accumulated guilt, the darkness, the twisted karma of the human race. He was stepping into the ring with the principalities and powers that had enslaved humanity since the Garden of Eden. He asked his friends to watch, to hold the line with him, but they collapsed into sleep, their heavy eyes unable to withstand the spiritual pressure in the air. He was utterly alone. The sweat fell from his brow like great drops of blood, a medical phenomenon known as hematidrosis, occurring only under extreme psychological stress. The internal pressure was so great, his capillaries were bursting. He was pleading with the Father, asking if there was any other way to break the curse. The silence from heaven was the answer. There was no other way. The debt had to be paid. The ancient machinery of justice had to be satisfied. And then, the torches appeared in the distance, a serpentine line of fire winding its way up the hill. The clanking of Roman armor, the muffled orders of the temple police. The betrayal was at hand. He stood up, wiping the blood and sweat from his face, and woke his sleeping followers. The time for hiding was over. The hour of darkness had arrived. He stepped forward to meet the mob, not as a victim caught in a trap, but as a captain engaging the enemy. When they asked for Jesus of Nazareth, he spoke 2 words: I am. The power of that name, the divine handle used at the burning bush, carried such force that the soldier stumbled backward and fell to the ground. Even in this moment of surrender, he was the one in control. He permitted them to take him. He extended his hands for the chains, allowing the creatures he created to bind their creator. The disciples fled into the night, swallowed by the shadows, leaving him to face the abyss alone. The trial was a sham, a hurried assembly of illegal hearings held in the dead of night, violating every protocol of Jewish jurisprudence. But the verdict was never in doubt. The light of the world was about to be extinguished. The stage was set for the final bloody act.
They dragged him to the place of the skull, a jagged hill outside the city walls, known as Golgotha. It was a landscape scarred by death, a public theater of cruelty where Rome displayed the consequences of rebellion. But this was no ordinary execution. As the iron nails were driven through flesh and bone, anchoring the Creator to the wood of a cursed tree, the atmosphere began to shift. The mockery of the crowd, the gambling of the soldiers, the weeping of the women, it all continued under a sky that was slowly turning the color of a bruise. At high noon, when the sun should have been at its zenith, a supernatural darkness strangled the light. This was not a solar eclipse, for the moon was full at Passover. This was the cosmos itself recoiling in horror. The sun refused to shine on the murder of its architect. For 3 hours, the world was plunged into a primordial gloom, a physical manifestation of the spiritual judgment falling upon that lonely figure. In that suffocating darkness, the true battle was joined. This was the moment the baby in the manger had been born for. The ancient prophecies whispered in the courts of lost civilizations were converging on this single point in time. He was drinking the cup of wrath, absorbing the toxic runoff of human history. Every betrayal, every murder, every lie, every act of malice, from the first bite of the fruit to the final tick of the clock. He became the lightning rod for the justice that should have incinerated the world. The physical agony of the cross, the asphyxiation, the blood loss, the shock, was merely the backdrop for a spiritual cataclysm that no human eye could fully perceive. He was entering the stronghold of the enemy, the very jaws of the Leviathan, not to negotiate, but to break its teeth. Then came the cry that shattered the silence, a shout of victory rather than defeat. "It is finished." He did not have his life taken from him. He dismissed his spirit. At that precise moment, the earth convulsed. The ground shook with such violence that rocks split open, a seismic testament to the death of God. Inside the great temple in Jerusalem, the massive veil separating the Holy of Holies from the rest of the world, a tapestry as thick as a man's hand and woven with the colors of the universe, was torn in two from top to bottom. No human hand could have ripped it. It was a divine declaration that the barrier was down. The quarantine was over. The distance between the divine and the dust had been bridged, not by our ascent, but by his descent. If uncovering these forgotten layers of the ancient narrative shifts your perspective on the past, subscribing ensures you won't miss the next investigation into the myths that shaped our world.
As the chaos subsided, a strange calm settled over the hill. The soldiers, hardened men who dealt in death daily, were shaken to their cores, confessing that this man was truly the Son of God. But the drama was far from over. His body was taken down, wrapped in linen and spices, a final act of tenderness in a brutal day, and laid in a borrowed tomb carved from solid rock. A massive stone was rolled across the entrance, sealing the darkness inside. The religious leaders, paranoid that the deception would continue, petitioned Pilate for a guard, and so a unit of Roman soldiers was stationed at the grave, and the imperial seal was affixed to the stone. It is the supreme irony of history. The might of the Roman Empire and the authority of the Jewish priesthood combined to keep a corpse in a grave. They were trying to lock the ocean in a bottle.
That would be it.
This is the hinge upon which all history turns. If the story ended at the cross, Jesus would be a tragic figure, a martyr to be pitied. But the empty tomb transforms the narrative from a tragedy into a comedy in the classical sense, a story with a triumphant resolution. The baby born in the grime of the stable, hunted by a king, exiled to Egypt, and raised in obscurity, had completed his mission. The invasion was successful. The silent night of Christmas was the insertion of special forces behind enemy lines. Easter morning was the raising of the victory flag over the enemy's citadel. The dark legends of old, the cycles of death and rebirth, the desperate myths of dying gods, they were all shadows cast by this singular, concrete event. So, what really happened on Christmas 2,000 years ago? It wasn't just the birth of a teacher or a moral philosopher. It was the arrival of a warrior. It was the moment the infinite contracted into the finite to wage war on the entropy that devours us. When we look back at the manger through the lens of the empty tomb, the scene changes. The pastoral quiet is replaced by the tension of a ticking clock. The gifts of the Magi, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, are no longer just tribute. They are provision for a king, a priest, and a sacrifice. The story of Christmas is the prologue to the greatest rescue operation in the cosmos. We live now in the time between the victory and the final implementation. The war is won, but the fighting continues in the hearts of men. The ancient dark legends have been answered by a true myth, one that entered history and left a footprint that no amount of time can erode. The invitation that stands today is not merely to believe a set of facts, but to join the resistance, to align oneself with the invading kingdom that operates on love rather than power, on sacrifice rather than conquest. The manger is empty, the cross is empty, the tomb is empty. The throne, however, is occupied. The light that entered the world in the darkness of a Judean night has proven that the darkness cannot overcome it, and that, in the final analysis, is the only story that matters.